everybody. We got a great one today, for a change. You've never heard of my guest. Will Bunch is the national opinion columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and he's written a book entitled After the Ivory Tower. Frankly, not a great title. Look, I've written some #1 New York Times bestsellers. I know how to title a book. Rush Limbaugh is a big fat idiot, and lies and lying liars who tell them. A fair and balanced look at the right. After the Ivory Tower is not a great title. It is, however, a really important book. Now, the Ivory Tower refers, of course, to higher education, to college, the university. But after the Ivory Tower, not a great title, but really fascinating book. And let me tell you why. It makes the argument and proves the argument that an enormous source of the division in our country today is how our nation's approach to higher education changed over the last 75, 80 years. And it starts with the end of World War II. Now, I'm 71. I'm a baby boomer. My dad's generation fought and won World War II. In 1944, Congress passed the GI Bill, which gave that generation of mainly white men, gave them a free college education plus a stipend. It gave them free college and money for housing and for food so they could go to college. Now, up until World War II, only about 5% of American adults had a college education. College was for the elites. Critics of the GI Bill said that the thing was a big waste, that giving these guys coming back from World War II a higher education was just going to be a big waste. They weren't college material. Now, these are guys who had lived through the Great Depression, were hardened by World War II. These guys became the greatest generation. These guys became our scientists and engineers, doctors, businessmen, artists, public servants, and they were given their college education plus housing and an allowance. And what's more, college continued to be inexpensive for the next couple of decades plus, almost free. A Pell Grant used to pay for 75% of a college education. Then in the 1960s, Ronald Reagan ran against Berkeley in California, the University of California at Berkeley. And Reagan said, well, we've got to stop paying for these kids to develop their intellectual curiosity. He said that. Then in the 80s, the fairness doctrine went away. Broadcasters no longer would have to present both sides of an issue, and an obese college dropout, Rush Limbaugh, built an empire based on a foundation of racism. Have you ever noticed that everyone on the FBI most wanted list looks like Jesse Jackson? He said that. Homophobia, he gave regular reports on gay men dying of AIDS and would play I'll Never Love This Way Again while doing it. Hating feminazis and environmentalists and scientists, intellectuals, and elites in general, and hippies and their lifestyle, including drugs, calling my friend Jerry Garcia, "Sir dead doper." Even though Rush became so badly addicted to OxyContin that he was tried for doctor shopping and lost his hearing, he became not a dead doper, but a deaf doper. No wonder Rush got the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Without Rush, there would be no President Donald Trump. Meanwhile, the assault on the cost of college continued, and Republican politicians in state after state skyrocketed the cost of a higher education, even as a college degree became more and more essential to building a middle-class life. So young people became saddled with debt. Heather McGee, on an earlier podcast, told us that the average African-American family headed by a college graduate has less net wealth than the average family of a white high school dropout. Meanwhile, affluent American families were able to get SAT prep, get prestigious high school internships during the summer, go to space camp, and get them into elite colleges that set them on a prosperous path. And working class folks in red areas of the country saw jobs leave, saw more OxyContin, and decided that college debt was just not worth the risk. So we have this divide. When Donald Trump in 2016 said, "I love the poorly educated," a lot of blue America scoffed. But he was tapping into a deep well of resentment that was key to his victory in 2016. And that is essential into understanding where we are politically right at this very moment. So that is the subject of today's conversation. And today, Will Bunch will provide you a perspective of why we're where we are today that I think is essential. Before we get to Will, though, just a bit about Donald Trump and his legal troubles, which got much worse in the last few days. There's been all this conjecture of what Merrick Garland is going to do in terms of prosecuting the former president. Usually you've been hearing, does Garland go for the easier to prove but less serious offense involving the classified and top secret documents he kept as resort and lied about over and over again? Or do you take on the more serious charge of trying to overturn the 2020 election? A far more serious charge, but harder to prove in a court of law, presumably. Well, yesterday that seemed to change, because even as the Mar-a-Lago piece has become what appears to be a stunningly easy case to prove. They've got videotape now of the documents being moved by his caretaker, who has given up the ghost. He's talked. And you just have to think, why did Trump do all this unless he's hiding some terrible monumental crime that has compromised our national security? This, it appears to me, has become both a slam dunk in proving and far, far more serious than we know. Did he sell secrets to foreign powers? If you know Trump, he's done this for some nefarious reason, quite possibly money, or he's being shaken down by the Russians. Who knows? So that one, yep, easy to prove. But the attempt to steal the election and the insurrection, is that really that hard? Here's some of the stuff that was nailed down yesterday. I'm recording this on Friday, and the hearing was Thursday. He knew he lost. We've learned he told Mark Meadows, yeah, I know I lost, but it would be embarrassing to admit it. Meadows said to Hutchinson, the Cassie Hutchinson, a lot of times he'll tell me that he lost, but he wants to keep fighting it. Can you imagine George H.W. Bush coming up with that? Well, we really got clobbered there. Embarrassing, but don't want to acknowledge it. Don't want to do that. Why would we do that? People be saying, hey, Bush is saying he lost. Wouldn't be prudent. Just say we won in a landslide. Either it's true or it isn't. Just say it's true. Just say we won. That's it. We won. And if it comes to an armed insurrection, so be it. Prudent thing here, retain power at all cost. This is Bannon before the election.
And what Trump's going to do is just declare victory, right? He's going to declare victory. But that doesn't mean he's the winner. He's just going to say he's the winner.
Roger Stone, same damn thing. Some footage was obtained via subpoena. The 10-minute clip is an excerpt from the 170 hours of footage a film crew recorded while following Stone for a documentary called A Storm Foretold. In the video clip dated November 1, Stone can be seen speaking to two men at an unspecified location, saying he hoped they would be celebrating after the votes were in. This is the quote. I really do suspect it'll still be up in the air, and when that happens, the key thing to do is to claim victory, Stone said. Possession is 9/10 of the law. No, we won. Fuck you. Sorry, over. We won. You're wrong. Fuck you. Okay. Zoe Lofgren, one of the members of the committee, said that Brad Parscale, the Trump's former campaign manager, told the committee that he understood as early as July that Trump would say he had won the election even if he lost. This is going to be pretty damn easy to prove. I'm sorry. Now, is this going to make any difference in the midterms? You would hope so. But things are just so screwed up. Our information universes are now so completely separate, and this is very frightening. The best we can do here is just try to shed some light on why that's the case, and that's why I'm talking with Will Bunch today. Hopefully, this will provide you with a useful perspective on why we are so divided. So we got a great one today, for a change. This puts education right at the center of where we are right now in terms of divide in this country, right?
I believe it is at the center. I mean, certainly you see it in the, polling data, which shows every election cycle, more and more the Democrats are becoming the party of people with college degrees, and more the Republicans not only are the party of people without college diplomas, the working class voter, but that's who they've been tailoring their pitch and appeal to more and more. So what they call now the college, non-college divide, I mean, this is a term we weren't using until a few years ago, but really over time it's come to define our politics. And, I wanted to understand why. I mean, college, it's not logical that college would be the thing that divides us. So I wanted to find out why it was and what is it about college itself or higher education, perhaps put better, that causes that.
Well, the book frames it so well. And the first history you kind of talk about is the GI Bill. Prior to World War II, what percentage of Americans had got college degrees, like 5%?
Yeah, hardly anybody in America attended college before World War II. 5%, you're talking about historically WASPy elite families going to Ivy League schools and a small growing professional class, but hardly anybody. Most people actually during World War II, the majority of Americans didn't finish high school. Teenagers went to work in factories, they went to work on farms, and that was the norm. And so that's one reason why the GI Bill and the success of it took everybody by surprise.
Okay, so the GI Bill basically said everybody, mainly guys, right, coming back, we're going to give them free education. And there's some controversy like, it's going to be a lot of hillbillies getting college education. And it turns out these hillbillies, these guys coming back from World War II, really made use of this in a way that became the engine in America for what happened to us in the 50s.
Yeah, there's an amazing quote. The president of the University of Chicago, who was this kind of curmudgeon who also famously banned their successful football program, but he also said that these returning vets would make their campuses into, quote, hobo jungles, unquote. And that was the perception. Look, the perception was that the average working class or middle class American was not college material. I mean, this was a myth that a lot of these colleges held on to, that, it was kind of an early version of the meritocracy myth, that most Americans weren't worthy of a college education. And like you said, these GIs just shattered that myth. They had been through the Great Depression. They'd been through World War II. They came back. They knew what a golden opportunity this was. And it was. I mean, the GI Bill not only paid full tuition, and not just for, your basic state university, but if you went to Harvard, it would pay your full tuition. And you got a living stipend, your books, everything was covered. It was really an experiment of what would happen if we made college a public good, the way that K through 12 education had been established as a public good in America. And it was just phenomenally successful, and it got Americans realizing that college could be the American dream for a lot of people, more than just the vets, because in kind of a virtuous cycle, you had this huge baby boom that you were on the vanguard of, Al, and colleges started expanding for these GIs, and they just kept growing to cope with this baby boom that was coming.
And everything seemed to be going fine in your book.
Yes.
Until Ronald Reagan.
It's like the plot twist in every political nonfiction story.
Well, because we've had to live through Trump, and everyone's going like, I guess Reagan wasn't so bad. And then you read your book and you go, oh, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you have to remember what he was all about. He built on grievance politics just like Trump did. It was just an earlier version of it. The grievance was that we've given these young people an amazing opportunity to go to college. Just to set up real quickly, I mean, one of the features of the golden age of college in the 40s, 50s, 60s was an emphasis on liberal education. You had more students majoring in the humanities, more students majoring in liberal arts. The overriding belief, and surveys back this up, was that young people felt they were going to college to develop a meaningful philosophy of life. that it was right? Which tell that to today's student, right? So and there was a swing at that time away from careerism. So these kids, they valued things like critical thinking, and as you know well, they turned their critical thinking towards things like racial segregation in the South initially, and then as we got deeper into the 60s, they turned their attention heavily towards the hypocrisy of the Vietnam War, which had a personal impact on a lot of young people. Yes, you do remember that. So a conservative establishment freaked out over this. Ronald Reagan's famous line in 1967, the first year that he served as governor in California, was that taxpayers shouldn't be subsidizing the intellectual curiosity of young people, and that became the prevailing philosophy. And what that really means is he was foreshadowing what actually happened, which is the privatization of college. In other words, it's college did not.
Let's start with Berkeley, because he ran against Berkeley, or he ran on Berkeley. So explain that to the folks.
Well, Berkeley, it might shock some people, although there's been a lot of chatter about this, so maybe some folks know this. But I mean, the University of California historically had been tuition free. I mean, it was basically, burned into the state's constitution and its identity that it would give free college education to its young people. And, there were some fees and whatever, but it was essentially, you had to buy books, but it was basically free. Coincidentally or not, it also kind of was the vanguard of young people and this idea that they weren't children who were like wards of the university, that they had free thought and free speech. And there was an episode, crazy, right? So there was this episode in 1964, and it was right at the height of a lot of politicking around the civil rights movement, that Berkeley tried to limit where students could hand out political materials, ban it basically. And the protest was called the Berkeley Free Speech Movement. Mm-hmm. It really predated the Vietnam protest. It was really the first kind of big campus-wide outburst. And it was a very epic event. I would encourage people to read up on it. I describe it in the book, of course, but the students won, basically. They got the faculty on their side, and this kind of flowed into Vietnam protests, which, of course, spread to other campuses. So it happened in 1964. 1965 was when Reagan announced his candidacy for governor. He was a long shot. He had just made a name for himself supporting Barry Goldwater, and they urged him to run for governor. There was a seemingly popular incumbent in Pat Brown, Jerry Brown's father. But Reagan seized on two things. One was you'd also had the Watts riots, so there was a racial component. But the other thing was Berkeley. And by then you had, the Jefferson airplane and the psychedelic, strobe lights and those blob screens or whatever you call them. And
yeah, the height of civilization. I remember that.
Yeah, the wave, as Hunter S. Thompson called it, right? It was the peak of the wave of the 60s. And, he gave a speech saying that at the Cow Palace, saying that students were doing unthinkable things that he couldn't talk about. And, he sexualized it, and that, their bodies were gyrating under these strobe lights. It's really quite an incredible speech. And, he really fueled resentment among
disgusting things, gyrating, having premarital sex, disgusting.
they were, in his words. But, apparently a lot of people bought into this. A lot of middle class folks who were hearing third hand what these young people were doing on these campuses, and they bought into this disgust. And, Reagan, the former underdog, won by 1 million votes. He won in a landslide. And it's interesting. He actually he wanted to halt the practice of free tuition. He actually was unsuccessful because there was still a lot of support for free tuition, surprisingly, right? He raised fees. He set the groundwork. By the time he left office, he'd set the groundwork for tuition. And we all know that the University of California system, like most state universities, is expensive. It's increasingly exclusive. It, lacks the diversity that it should have. There's all kinds of problems today.
And this is a basic thrust of your book, which is that we went from free in California and for the GIs and college
and cheap for everybody else,
and very cheap for everybody else. And my wife's family, there were 5 kids. All 4 girls went to college on Pell Grants,
right?
And scholarships. The Pell Grant at that time was like 75% of the cost of college.
And now it's, I think, 30% if it's even that high.
Yeah.
And they expect you to make up the difference of loans. When they say privatize, it's funny because
now they do. Now they expect you to take it in loans, which is we're going to get to college debt is a big theme of this, and it's just the cost of college going from you start off with the GI Bill, all these guys coming back from the war, going to college free and getting stipends.
And I mean, the apartments and books and right.
Yeah. To now. And then this is basic theme of the book, what's divided this country, because now going to college is a risk. I think there's one statistic you have where like 65% of white men think it's a risk to go to college.
A risky gamble.
Gamble to go to college. Now.
It's not worth the investment. The author of that study calls it economic fatalism. We talk about, and I know there's a lot of back and forth about how real it is, but we talk about economic anxiety, and what the point he's trying to make is it's not even anxiety. It's worse than that. It's fatalism. It's not even that I'm anxious about it. It's that there's no hope for people like me.
And then this is becomes a basic divide in our country. This horrible divide that we have. You go to Rush Limbaugh after Reagan, basically, and talk about the culture war. And he, of course, his show, which I wrote about.
Yes.
And
great book.
Thank you. Incredibly racist, incredibly homophobic, and just lying all the time, and stoking this class warfare, calling women feminazis and the environmental stuff. And, oh my God! Yeah.
And of course the AIDS period when he would do a role of people who died of AIDS and play I'll never love this way again in the background. Unbelievable stuff. And the thing is, and I'd be interested to hear your take because you're more of an authority on this subject than I am. But I mean, I feel like he was really skilled at making politics more cultural, that he turned just rather than just making it a political discussion, he made this into cultural warfare. And again, the real dividing line of the culture was education. The educated people were the crux of who he was going after, because people were going to college and becoming feminists, or they were going to college and becoming environmentalists, or the LGBTQ culture was thriving on campus.
What people should understand is how he was very talented.
Yeah,
I mean, I listened to a lot of
as did I. Yeah,
and there's a reason that he's got the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Trump, because I think without Rush, there's no Trump.
Yeah,
or at least there's a straight line from. And Trump, of course, said, I love the poorly educated. And Democrats and a lot of people thought, what a dumb thing to say. And of course, actually, it helped him to say that.
Well, sure. These people who wear T-shirts calling themselves deplorables, they embrace these terms.
Well, sure. But Hillary didn't exactly call them deplorables. She called their racism, sexism, and xenophobia a basket of deplorables.
But they embrace this as a badge of honor. Of course, I mean, the mindset is that, these people who go to college, they're just book smart, but they can't screw in a light bulb, which sometimes there's something.
Well, the point is that this divide has become about resentment. And the resentment, the theme of your book basically is that so much of this has been stoked by the cost of college. And also this resentment of elites, which is fueled by this bogus concept of meritocracy. Paul Tough, a journalist who writes brilliantly about education, I had him on about his book, The Years That Matter Most, about college. It's about how our university system perpetuates a privilege and injustice at every level of our society. And you write about it too, how affluent families can give their kids every advantage. The kids will go to a great high school, a funded suburban high school with every bells and whistles. They can get SAT prep. They don't have to work after school, so they can get piano lessons or travel to Europe or maybe get a great internship over the summer. And you get a coach to help you with your essay about the meaningful social service you did when you had your summer off instead of having to work. And then, of course, there are legacies. If one of your parents went to an Ivy League school and are donors, it's easier to get your kid in. And of course, there's all these other elite schools or great schools. These Ivy League schools aren't really what this is about.
No, because they educate such a small sliver, I mean, there's a pyramid, where community colleges, which don't get talked about nearly enough, are really the base of the system. State universities like the ones we have here in Pennsylvania, like Kutztown University or Westchester, not the big names, but the basic state universities. And then you've got the flagship state universities like a Penn State. Then you've got the private schools kind of at the top of this pyramid. And it is a pyramid. They're educating a smaller sliver. I don't think it's too strong a word to say the meritocracy is rigged. Like you said, these families, white suburban kids are coming from better schools, but their parents, like you said, have invested thousands of dollars on SAT prep. And they get essay coaching to write the college essay, which of course probably helps them write better.
They also have the ability to do something in the summer that they can write about, or that is something on their application.
Yeah, the foreign travel, right, and all those things.
Or going to space camp, you know what I mean? It's like
no, exactly. And but then then there's also the financial part, though, right? Because we all know that, white family household net worth or family wealth is 20 times African American family wealth in this country. It's an unbelievable statistic. And that's exactly, family wealth. It's funny. My education at Brown University was basically paid for because my mom's unmarried aunt, for better or worse, died the year before I got accepted, or I don't know how they would have paid for it, to be honest. But that was family wealth, that was passed down to my family. And that's what happens in white households.
Heather McGee told me this statistic that a household led by a Black college graduate has, on average, less net wealth than a household led by a white high school dropout.
Yeah, I saw that statistic somewhere recently too. It's
and a lot of that is from home ownership.
Yeah,
and also the debt that Black graduates college,
which is increasingly becoming college debt. Yeah,
I know we don't
want to get ahead of ourselves, but it's just a big explainer of the debt crisis. And but getting back to resentment, also people from disadvantaged white communities, the Rust Belt, rural areas, they also don't have the college culture. They have what we were just talking about, this economic fatalism that college isn't for them. But yet at the same time, if they do just go straight from high school into the workforce, statistics have shown they're going to earn a lot less money over the course of their lifetime. And also, if the system is a meritocracy, which again is a very complicated term, but if we're going to define the system as a meritocracy, and we're going to define a college diploma as the ultimate badge of meritocracy, that this is the ultimate proof of your merit, that you worked hard and you got a college diploma. Well, 63% of Americans don't have a 4-year college degree. And in a way, you're saying these people have less merit than the other 37%. And they feel that. Those people feel that viscerally. And I'm not, there's a lot of things, when we're talking about the voters who also fuel the Donald Trump movement. There's a lot of other things going on around race and misogyny, and it gets complicated. And I don't want to give.
Well, that's.
I don't want to give it a free pass, But we do need to talk about these things also,
That's the culture part that we're talking about with Rush, the feminazis, etc.
Yeah, right.
But basically, this kind of also you talk in the book about the big sort, and the big sort is how divided we are, like physically, that conservatives are in the exurbs, right? That people in the exurbs tend to be a Trumper.
Yeah, they want a big piece of land. They're very into individual rights, gun ownership and all of that.
So people are divided into these communities, and they're also divided into where they get their information.
Yeah. Well, I just going to say real quickly, one of the biggest dividers, and because this really, I think, speaks to the role of college. You might be originally from a disadvantaged Rust Belt community like Youngstown or somewhere, but if you do excel in K through 12 and high school and go off to a good college, you're probably not moving back to Youngstown, right? You're probably going where the great jobs are. You're going to Austin, Texas, or Silicon Valley, or New York, or maybe DC if you're interested in politics. You're going to places like that. And college-educated people, they want a certain experience. They want cool restaurants. They want cool bands. They want certain things. And the people in these communities who didn't have college opportunities are the left behind. They have their organizations, they have their churches, they have community groups like the VFW or whatever, and they're cohesive in that way. But it's fascinating. There've been studies that communities that are very cohesive and actually have less economic activity than those that aren't. The more this divide happens, the more this big sort happens, the more it accelerates. That if you're a liberal-minded college graduate, you don't want to live in Youngstown, you want to live in Austin, and people divide themselves, and then it sets up this system where you don't even know people with different points of view or different backgrounds, the way that you might have 50 or 60 years ago.
Which is this big sort and this divide where your people are not just getting information because online and
or just
Facebook
with their neighbors,
but their neighbors, and so this divide is just becoming worse and worse and worse until we're seeing what we're seeing today, where we have 75% of Republicans believing the election was stolen, and it's really friggin' scary.
Yeah. If you live in a place like South Central Pennsylvania, the rural area where Doug Mastriano, who is one of the scariest politicians I've seen come down the pike, has emerged from, you possibly belong to one of these very fundamentalist churches, and you're taking part in certain Facebook groups. Every yard sign you see in your community is, a Trump flag or for Mastriano, and that's the cultural milieu that
he's going to lose, right?
Yeah, but it could be close. But he's going to lose. But I have faith he's going to lose.
We should make it clear. You're in Pennsylvania. You wrote your career has been at the Philadelphia Inquirer, right?
Correct, in Daily News and Inquirer. Yeah. So, but Pennsylvania is a state that went for Trump in 2016 by 44,000 votes. So things can happen here. There is an energized rural conservative electorate in this state. Now they were surpassed in 2020 by suburbanites and urban residents who came out for Biden, and we're hoping that's going to happen again in 2022.
Are you getting any sense, this is off topic a little bit, but are you getting any sense, since you're in Pennsylvania, of the January 6th hearings plus the Mar-a-Lago documents, et cetera, having an effect on Republican voters saying like, oh my God, this is...
Yes, a little bit. It's funny. We have our two big local or not local, but statewide races have such characters in them, between Mastriano being the scary, fascist type person that he is. And then, of course, you have these kind of two personalities in Dr. Oz and John Fetterman running for the Senate, who are both fascinating personalities. And that's where kind of the energy is going. And, and I think why Democrats are optimistic. I think part of it is, Oz has been so well defined by Fetterman as a New Jersey person who's just out of touch with Pennsylvania. I think
also Oz has kind of characterize himself that way.
Yeah, right.
Everything he said.
His life has characterized that. Yeah, right. Exactly. So, Mastriano scares people, and also I think we have a large young population that the youth turnout here is so critical in terms of which way the state's going to go. I honestly think that under 30 voters are a big reason why Joe Biden won barely in 2020, and I was terrified up until about 4 months ago that those people weren't going to vote in the midterms. But I'm the parent of two 20-somethings who actually live in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, the two big cities in the state, and their friends are energized now.
What energized them exactly?
The Dobbs decision, I think, mainly.
Right.
And the Dobbs decision flowed into the bill that addresses this Inflation Act or whatever they call it, but it's really a climate change bill. And then it flowed into college debt forgiveness was hugely popular with young voters. I mean, hugely.
Well, you talk a lot about debt and forgiving debt, and also where we need to go forward. One of the things you do talk about is, we should have free community and technical college, right?
Yeah, we've been talking about this since 1947.
This was a big issue with me. When I first got in, it was as the Great Recession was hitting, and there was this one county in Minnesota where there was Alexandria Technical College, where in this Douglas County, the unemployment rate was like 4% lower than the rest of the state.
Huh.
And it was because they had this unbelievably good technical college.
I mean, there's a disconnect. I mean, we've channeled so much energy into trying to funnel all kids towards four-year college. And I think four-year college is great. I mean, there's a reason that people from other nations like China and India are anxious to send their children to American universities.
And liberal arts, as you're saying, which is what our focus was when that was what I studied, and it develops a lot of things that employers want, by the way.
Yes, the kind of skills employers want critical thinking, So
yeah,
absolutely.
I mean, so liberal arts. That's not liberal arts education is what I believe in for college, but there are folks that aren't right for that or don't want to do that, and I've seen incredibly successful people who go to a community and technical college, learn how to do very technical skills and like in manufacturing and in electronics and in data and make great careers. You see them working for a small manufacturer and becoming the guy. The guy.
One of the things I went out of my way to do in my book after the Ivory Tower falls is I have a long riff about, it's kind of a fluky thing. It's this trade college, happens to be in my home county, Delaware County, right outside of Philadelphia. It's called the Williamson School of Trade, and it was just created by a millionaire of the 19th century who didn't have any heirs, and he left this money to found this school where orphans originally, it's not orphans now, but the original idea was that orphans would learn a trade. And they've kept this trade school, and if you get admitted, it's because of their huge endowment, it's free. So these kids who get into this are getting a 3-year education. They actually give them some other, I don't know if I would call it civics, but moral. It's not all carpentry and masonry, although a lot of it is. But they learn those skills, and employers are tripping over themselves to hire these kids at good salaries. And it's just an idea that we totally lost sight of. So when you talk about fixing it, I mean, I talk in the book about the college problem, and that's just a simple 2-word way to define it. But really the college problem is really a problem of what do we do with our young people when they turn 18. And it's not always, like you said, sending them to a 4-year liberal arts college. It could be a trade school. It could be apprenticeships. I devote the last chapter of the book to a pitch for a gap year for 18-year-olds of
some kind of community service.
Community service, universal community service. I mean, in theory, it would probably work best if it was mandatory, but we don't really.
But that's not going to happen.
We don't really do. We don't. We don't do mandatory very well in the U.S. In 2022, as you probably noticed during the COVID situation, for example.
Oh, that was good. That was a good thing that came out of this this whole anti-college thing is the anti-science part.
Yes, right.
The right wing has embraced now.
Yeah,
on climate and on COVID. It's
and what is the deal with this QAnon? I mean, you saw these Trump has gone full QAnon. You know, there's a QAnon song that he now plays in the background of his monologues, and people in the audience have been raising their one finger up in this kind of fascist looking salute. Yeah, you have to go online. I read my last column for the Inquirer is about it.
So in other words, if for God's sakes,
yes,
he's their nominee, and if for God's sakes they win, meaning they're trying, elect these secretaries of state, they're trying to set it up so he can steal it like he almost tried this time. If he becomes, we're done. It's over. It's gone. It's done.
Yeah. The American experiment is blown up in the lab, basically.
Okay. Well, thanks for cheering me up.
Yeah, this is why, I mean, look, we're kind of at a crossroads about higher education. In the last 2 years, public trust in universities and higher education has plummeted. It's dropped by 19%. That's largely driven by Republicans, but I think, Democrats are kind of, normal people who aren't Republicans are fed up by the cost and some of the other issues. And it's becoming a real crisis. And the two solutions are, the college infrastructure can just collapse, or we can try and get back to this original good ideals of the 1940s and 50s, that how do we make college a public good, and how do we make it more affordable, and how do we make it more accessible so more people have opportunities to do the things that they want to do. And, the cynicism on the Republican side in the last year, they've really leaned hard into this. And you see Ron DeSantis doing it at his press conferences, belittling college, that the idea that it's a waste of money that you're spending $100,000 to get, they're obsessed with this idea that there's something called a gender studies degree that everybody's getting. And Charlie Kirk, this horrible provocateur on the right has his new book is called The College Scam, and that's how they're trying to spin it. There's another book out. I don't think it's sold very well, but the title is just Don't Go to College. 20, 30 years ago, conservatives were like, well, we need more conservative professors. We need more free speech. And all right, we can debate about that. That's a fair debate to have, in my opinion, but they've given up on that. Now it's just college is a waste. Don't go. And we're living in a world already of climate change denial, of COVID vaccine denial, of QAnon and the big lie about the 2020 election. I mean, all of those things are related to a lack of critical thinking. I'm not saying it's a one-to-one relationship, but the more you emphasize learning, knowledge, how to get information and how to develop your critical thinking skills, I think will tamp down conspiracy theories or science denial and all these other things that are happening. So we need to have a national conversation about how do we save higher education, not how do we throw it out in the trash, and it would mean probably some radical reforms. I think what Biden did with debt cancellation was great. It was a first step. Yeah. It was a first step. You're talking about maybe $500 billion of a $1.75 trillion problem. So you still have more than $1 trillion in debt that's still out there. So you need to do more on that front somehow. But if you don't do anything about the cost of college going forward, you're just going to have another debt mountain build up.
The history of this is how state governments have stopped supporting the tuition.
Right. That's one of the problems, because we saw this with Obamacare, right, where these red states wouldn't even buy into Obamacare, right?
Well, they wouldn't buy into the Medicaid expansion.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that part of it, right. Another facet of our system.
Which is free money to them, and they wouldn't take that.
Right, to make a political statement. I mean, the college piece is a little bit more complicated, but as you know, and I mean, our system, really it's the states and not the federal government that are the main driver of public universities. These are state systems. And, the majority of states, there have been a few good states like Maryland and New York that have done an okay job, but the majority of states have let the funding dry up. I mean, again, I'll use my home state of Pennsylvania as an example. The late 20th century, taxpayers paid for 75% of the cost of the public university system. So it was still close to being a public good, right? And they let it drop to 25%. Pennsylvania is one of the, I think, 17 states that spent more money on prisons than its universities. It's just a horrible case of neglect. And this kind of happened, in my opinion, there wasn't a lot of debate about this. It was kind of a frog in boiling water situation where just it got slightly worse every year and there wasn't much public debate about it until it happened. And now people are wondering why going to a state university leaves you with $40,000 or $50,000 in debt. And this is why, because they want you to make up the difference. And if you're an ambitious, young, middle-class person, of which there are millions in this country, to stay in the middle class or advance and do the things you want to do in life, that at least right now, the way it's set up, you've got to have this college diploma. And so your options are to gamble on the debt or to not go to college and be guaranteed of losing out.
And then, of course, there are all these universities that popped up that hedge funds supported and that were Corinthians.
Late stage capitalism abhors a vacuum, In fact, Goldman Sachs, the vampire squid, right, that looks for opportunities everywhere. I mean, they were a big backer of this company called EMDC, which did things like the art school chain and other schools. And in fact, I knew some people who worked in this, unfortunately, but they had boiler rooms. It was like Glengarry Glen Ross. I mean, they were using these high pressure sales tactics to get kids. It's like, you got to have a diploma and blah, 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 and they set up a pricing system that basically the tuition is the maximum amount of loans that they could get through the federal government, knowing in a system where the schools get the money right away and it's the student is, on the hook. Once the kids were hooked and once the schools had their federally guaranteed loan money deposited, they gave them minimal education, right? That, they hired not the greatest teachers in some cases. And, part of that's just because they didn't pay them very much, I guess. And they promised job opportunities for graduates. And between the inferior education they got at these schools and then the arrival of the Great Recession, those job opportunities didn't materialize. So now you're tens of thousands of dollars in debt for a degree that's kind of worthless for a lot of people.
But Betsy DeVos really kind of liked those institutions, didn't she?
She worked to bring them back. Obama, one of Obama's education policies were kind of all over the place, but one of the better things is you were in the Senate during those years. One of the better things about his education policy was he did aggressively try and rein in these for-profit colleges with some success, and we're still working that out. And Betsy DeVos came in to undo that because that's what those people do. I mean, that's their philosophy, that everything should be privatized. And so now Biden's in, and now we're trying to. It's very similar to climate change, where one side takes a step forward and then it gets undone by the other side. And now, they've canceled the debts of some of these kids who went to the worst schools, like Corinthian that you mentioned, which is good. So that's the first step. But the problem is not as bad as it was 15 years ago, I don't think.
The college should be on the line for the loan. In other words, don't you think? I think you actually suggested it in your book, right?
Yeah, I agree. I didn't really get too heavily into that issue, but I do agree to some point, especially to the extent that colleges are absolutely colleges have more responsibility, I think, to let applicants know what they're really getting into.
I actually wrote a piece of legislation to do a certain form, so they had to do that, and that was my piece.
Yeah, which absolutely is called for. I profiled some individuals in my book who exemplify some of the trends I talk about. And for what young people experience, I talked to this young African-American kid from South Jersey who didn't have college ambitions, but then he went to the Temple campus one day across the river in Philadelphia and said, "This is my dream. I want to go here." Well, of course, first of all, by crossing the Delaware River, that increased the cost, right? But he was determined to go to Temple. That this was his goal in life. He had to go to this college, and they sold him, like so many of these kids, they sold him a bill of goods. They said, all right, well, you can, if you really want to do this, you can do it. You can borrow money and your mom can get this Parent Plus loan. And you probably know a little bit about the Parent Plus program. It's, there aren't limits on what people can borrow. There aren't credit checks. It's, and desperate parents who want to get their kid into the right school borrow all kinds of money on this program. So this kid who graduated during COVID and when there were no jobs, he and his mom ended up owing $150,000 in debt. Six-figure debt loads are not unusual. They're not the norm, but they're pretty common. And a lot of it, like you said, is because 18-year-olds not being told what they're getting into and their parents, and being told you should go to your dream college and pursue your dreams, but not being told what the cost of that is in this privatized system.
No, the college should tell them right up front what this is costing you. That should be part of the contract you pay,
Yeah, and because people would make some different decisions. This guy told me he actually went to community college for a semester to get his grades up to get into Temple, and he could have gone to community college for 2 years, right? And then, which would have been cheaper, and then transferred into Temple. And people are starting to get smarter about this. And there's a movement going on to, like IBM, for example, whatever we think of IBM, but
they make business machines, right?
International ones, yes.
Yes.
They've gone through all their job categories and realized that half of the jobs that they required college diplomas for, don't really need a college diploma.
Right.
And so they've removed those requirements. And there's a movement for certificate programs where you study computer technology or something for, or coding for a year and get a certificate instead of going to a 4-year program. And that could help some people. I mean, obviously, again, it could also be a Wild West like the for-profit colleges were to some degree. But, I always get...
Well, these can be public colleges too. I mean, they are. These are
some universities are getting
sure.
Right. Yeah. Universities should. I agree. I think universities should be taking I'd feel a lot more comfortable if universities, our public institutions, were taking the lead on this project.
This is part of the system in Minnesota, and I was a big champion of the community technical colleges. Basically, the theme of your book is that this educational divide is in very, very, very large part responsible for the political divide that we have now. And you point to statistics in terms of men and women until 1980 voted the same on Democratic and Republican, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
And then with Reagan changed. And now that gap has widened a lot.
Well, there's a lot of interplay there's a lot of interplay, I guess I would call it. That there's a gender gap in politics, and there's a college gap. But
gender gap in college, right?
But people forget that 60% of college enrollment now is female, which is a whole complicated issue, right? So those two things go hand in hand, and maybe that explains to some degree, this white male resentment culture. Why they are so terrified of the feminization of culture, and I think they probably associate that with college degrees. So it's a complicated issue. And I wrote this book because I think we just weren't talking about it enough. I mean, political writers say, it looks like there's this college, non-college divide, but they don't really say why. And, there's a lot of good academic writing about how do we fix college, but colleges seem kind of blind to the impact that they're having on the outside society. And we need to have this conversation. Yeah.
No, this is the first book I've read that so definitively outlines what this educational divide, this college, and the role that college education plays in it, and how it's created this political divide and cultural divide in this country. And that's why this is a very valuable book. After the ivory tower falls, Will Bunch, thank you so much for writing this book and for joining me. And also, get off the phone.
Yes,
turn
I know.
the phone off.
I thought I silenced it.
Well, I've done that before.
Yeah.
And whenever that happens, and it happens when on my side here, and I have a line that you can use if that happens to you again, which is, "I'm sorry, I need a liver."
I might actually. Who knows?
Okay, use that next time. If you're on another podcast, it goes off.
Well, yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm waiting for a liver.
That'll do.
That'll get you. That'll get you. It'll buy you one.
Yeah. Well, that was two, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you so much for your interest. It was fun talking to you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed listening. That beautiful music is by Leo Kottke, the great Leo Kottke. I want to thank Peter Ogburn for producing this podcast. We'll talk again next week.